My name is Donatas Kupčiūnas. I'm a Baltic Fellow at the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University and a Junior Research Fellow at Wolfson College. This event is being organized jointly by the Wolfson College Humanities Society and the Center for Geopolitics, or vice versa. And so without further ado, let me introduce to you our speaker who is visiting us from Gdansk, Poland. Dr. Jacek Kołtan is a philosopher and political scientist who is currently Director's Representative for Research at the European Solidarity Center in Gdansk and Assistant Professor at the Pomeranian Higher School. Now, the European Solidarity Center is really something special. They also have a museum, and if you're ever in Poland, it's a really must thing to do, to visit them. We did just recently, last year, and it was absolutely fabulous. Now, Jacek has studied at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, at Humboldt University, and at Free University in Berlin. His research interests cover social and political theory, history of the idea of solidarity, social movements, politics of memory, and crisis of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. Jacek is the editor and author of the volumes Solidarity, Democracy, Europe, published in 2021, Solidarity and the Crisis of Trust, as well as the anthology on the European Solidarity Center permanent exhibition. Jacek has also published on the philosophy of Heidegger in his work Social Being, the Identity of the Self in the Early Philosophy of Martin Heidegger and Karl Lawith in 2012. Jacek also teaches at the Academy of Fine Arts in Gdansk and at the Collegium of Artes Liberales at Warsaw University. Now, today Jacek is going to cover a really curious topic that has a really special meaning in Poland and in Gdansk in particular, because exactly 43 years ago, workers at the Lenin's shipyard in Gdansk actually showed to the Soviet bloc, but also to the West, what solidarity really means. And it's no wonder that there is a really deep tradition in Poland of thinking about solidarity. And I'm really delighted to say that today we have an accomplished thinker in that tradition. So Jacek, what is solidarity?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be with you here. Thank you, Center for Geopolitics and Wolfson College, especially Humanities Society, for hosting me here. Thank you, Donatas Kupčiūnas and Cezary Kudzewicz for organizing the lecture at the Wolfson College. I would like to start with a very simple question. What is solidarity? In a way, actually a banal question, or is it? It's a basic question for every researcher too. What is it? To ask the question related to the term solidarity may seem a bit unreasonable. I might very well assume we all know what it is. But I'm convinced we don't really. Solidarity has become a fundamentally unclear concept. And it should be perfectly familiar to us, but for various reasons we feel confused when somebody even mentions it. This is primarily because it has been misused in most descriptions of social relations. The word has been recently used more often. Solidarity has returned to us as a challenge in times of great waves of migration, but also in connection with the global threat of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is present virtually everywhere in almost everything that concerns social relations. The connection between people in a group is described as solidarity. So the famous historian of ideas, German historian of ideas, Reinhard Koselleck, has described a group of a key concept in Western civilization, the meaning of which remains difficult to define unambiguously as collective singulars. solidarities that are imbued with diverse meaning, although still referred to with the singular form. So solidarity is a polysemic as freedom or equality. Moreover, although the use of the term solidarity is dominated by the positive connotations, unity or full integration within the society, the American sociologist Richard Sennett, in his great book entitled Together, Rituals, Pleasures and Politics of Cooperation, sees a danger in solidarity as a very closed structure, creating a clearly defined identity and hostility towards outsiders. So these are two different dimensions of solidarity we can immediately think of. But let's look at some good old definitions. How do the most popular dictionaries define solidarity? The Encyclopedia Britannica, solidarity is a feeling of unity between people who have the same interests, goals, etc. For Merriam-Webster, it is the unity as a group or class that produces or is based on community of interests, objectives, and standards. In the Cambridge Dictionary, it is the agreement between and support for the members of a group, especially a political one. At the other university dictionary, solidarity is defined as a support by one person or a group of people for another because they share feelings, opinion, or aims. And at the other university learners dictionary, the learners dictionary goes with the unity or agreement of feeling or action, especially among individuals with a common interest, mutual support within a group. So it's pretty clear from these that Richard Sennett's warning are very well founded. In most cases, it is the term unity, or the same, or sharing aims, or community, common interests, that round off the meaning of solidarity. Only where the term agreement is used do we have a weaker form of defining unity. So using the grand categories of philosophical tradition, it is only sameness and not otherness that dominates in the way solidarity is defined. So solidarity is presented as a phenomenon essentially related to homogeneity. If we are in solidarity with somebody, that somebody is usually assumed to be like ourselves. I would like to counter this tendency and show that it's intellectual tradition that underlines the development of the concept. It is the heterogeneity of solidarity that matters a lot. It is the confrontation with otherness that is crucial to our understanding of the phenomenon of solidarity. That otherness that is fundamental to the experience of solidarity. So when words begin to lose their clear meanings, it is useful to go back to their sources. That's why I want to first talk about the history of ideas and the writings of social and political thinkers who used the term solidarity in an attempt to confront a dynamically changing reality. So my goal today is to get you a kind of conceptual reconstruction of this ambiguous idea. And to do so, I will go back to the moment of the birth of solidarity. In the process of this reconstruction, however, I will try also to create new meanings on the basis of the existing one. So in a second constructive step, I would like to propose a notion of solidarity that will be broad enough to take into account the ambiguity and richness of the phenomenon behind it, both the historical ones and those that are important for us today. If I do my job well, we will understand what solidarity has been and what it is today. I hope you see it beside me. Okay, perfect. Okay. Let us briefly trace the history of the idea. The origins of the term solidarity can be found in Roman civil law, in accordance with which every debtor was liable for the entire amount of money owed. So the rule known as obligatio insolidum presupposed the liability of co-obligors for the entirety of an obligation. Its modern form was used in France at the turn of the 18th century. And you can see some fragments from the Encyclopedia of Jacques, published in the middle of the 18th century. So this solidité, or co-obligation, began to be referred by the term solidarité, and found its place in the Code Civil, Napoleonic Code of 1804. But the term soon began to liberate itself from its source, legal meaning, and to appear in a more social context. In the early 19th century, social thinkers recognized the very descriptive power of solidarity. The term became useful for description or describing people's dependence on each other in social relationships. You can see quickly solidarity also became a normative term and took on a moral meaning, in which dependence meant a shared responsibility, one for all and all for one. I mean, in a kind of Three Musketeers style. And it's not an accident that Alexandre Dumas wrote his book in the 40s of the 19th century. That's the moment where of the transformation of the meaning of the term solidarity. Then the social thinker Pierre Leroux, a committed critic of Christianity, is regarded as the first to turn the word solidarity into a concept, and as part of his critique of religion, decided to replace Christian charity, caritas, with secularized solidarity. So his concept of solidarity already applied to all of humanity, not just one, but all were to support all. This is an important change of meaning, not one for all, but actually all for all. And in the middle of the 19th century, as an aftermath of the French Revolution, the discredited idea of fraternity or brotherhood was replaced by the idea of solidarity. So the two industrial revolutions associated with the mechanization of work and later the electrification of industry forced a rethinking of the division of labor, which became deeply specialized. And with this idea of organic solidarity, Emil Durkheim, the father of sociology, demonstrated the fundamental importance of so-called interdependency in the modern world, the cooperation of different parts of social body. Thus, the idea of solidarity rose to prominence at the end of the 19th century in Durkheim's theories and in the solidarist movement of Charles Gide and Léon Bourgeois, as much as later in the 20s and the 30s in the social theory of Max Scheler, Max Weber, and the ethics of Nikolai Hartmann, Karl Jasper's philosophy of existence, or Henri Bergson's philosophy of religion. Thus, the idea crystallizes as a concept and begins to develop critical political connotations. But it's interesting that it was really born in France, and then it moved in the middle of the 19th century to Germany. It's never really established as a concept, as a notion in Great Britain. So solidarity becomes political. Solidarity acquired political significance with the development of modern capitalism. As part of the opposition to the culture of individualism, market competition, and the exploitation of the so-called fourth state, bourgeois, workers, and peasants deprived of property, the idea became central to many international socialists, thinkers, communists, anarchists, French solidarists, cooperatives, workers' movements, and finally also German social democracy, among others. So the acts of solidarity were supposed to help create a kind of alternative world, to replace the unfettered individual freedom of owners with a network of interdependencies, of autonomous free individuals, and in place of competition, to propose a culture of cooperation. One of the most prominent social democrats of the 19th century, Karl Kautsky, in his Erfurt program of 1892, showed what a challenge it was at the time to break down the barriers between very diverse, fragmented social groups of uneducated workers, of specialized and experienced working groups, but also of women. That's the first moment of real serious liberation of women, and international cooperation to create social class consciousness and a community of interest. It is also noteworthy that this programmatic text for German social democracy refers to differences and efforts to transcend them. Now I come to my second thesis, solidarity as a modern idea. You can already notice that solidarity is a very modern idea. It expresses the social tensions and forms of social life of modernity. By modernity, I mean an epoch that began in the second half of the 18th century, politically conditioned by two revolutions, the American and the French ones, and technologically conditioned by the mechanization of production in all its phases and turbulences of electrification, mass production, then the post-industrial era in the 70s of the 20th century, and the rise of the digital in recent decades. Solidarity has been an important term. Among many definitions of modernity, it's worth noting processes that have played a particular role in shaping the idea of solidarity. I want to talk about 5 such processes. The first one is industrialization and technological development, connected, of course, with industrial revolutions that revolutionized labor relations and forms of labor organization in general. The second one is scientification, that is an increase in the importance of knowledge and the importance of instrumental reason. The third one is democratization, a process in which patterns of legitimation and justification of power have been objectified, and the representative system with mass political parties has become a dominant part of our political life. The fourth process was individualization. So the individual has become the ultimate point of reference against coercion and power. New models of life dependent on individualism arose, including the freedom of choice and responsibility for the consequences of choice, individual choices. And the last, fifth element, is the process of detraditionalization and secularization, a breakaway from tradition as a source of justification of power, and an uprooting of previous forms of social life, separation of state and religious institutions, a decline in the importance of religion in everyday life. And these 5 have affected the way solidarity has been defined as a very modern idea. Or to put it simple, solidarity is an expression of modernity. So let us take a closer look what solidarity is and is not. Understanding the meaning of modernity, we can better understand the meaning of solidarity. This is because solidarity is closely linked to the above-mentioned processes, especially to the idea of democratic politics ensuring the universal freedom and equality of every citizens guaranteed by law. It is all citizens collectively who become the source of law and guarantee freedom and equality in solidarity. So that you can see the very clearly transformation of the three principles of French Revolution. So let me offer additional comments here. Conceiving of solidarity as identical to Christian charity, which is a pretty obvious thing, is a serious misunderstanding. Solidarity finds its origins in a horizontal relationship of relatively equal citizens rather than in a metaphysically justified necessity of acting in accordance with a divine imperative in a vertical relationship. So, in other words, solidarity is not only a being for the other, but also, or always, a being with the other. And we can see also very clearly that solidarity is not synonymous with fraternity either, as modern society breaks with the very naive and sentimental concept of others as brothers or sisters, seeing people as a different fellow citizens, emancipated from traditional communities. So that's the core of the idea at the beginning of modernity. Now I come to the third thesis, which will be much more philosophical. The answer to the question, what is solidarity, must be as simple as possible, and I would like to propose the following definition. Solidarity is a leaning out to the other. This is a metaphorical answer, and I would like to explain its meaning by first referring to the inspiration I draw from physics. In physics, we speak of deflection. A body is displaced from its equilibrium by an impulse that has brought the body into oscillation. So the body moves away from its equilibrium, and the change in position plays an essential role here. This is because the dynamic causes the object to be momentarily outward from its original position. So an object that is fixed to the ground but has been vibrated changes its position to the oblique to vertical, but does not lose its fixation and is able to return to its original position. Right? So that's the movement. So the dynamic model is a good reference point for the experience of interpersonal solidarity. Let us analyze the phenomenon of solidarity using the classical example of the willingness to help someone in need. So the shape of this relationship will be crucial here, as it allows us to characterize the way in which the relationship experienced by the very subject reaching out to the person in need. To illustrate this phenomenon, I will use the paintings of the 20th century painter Wojciech van Gogh, who explored minimal art and opt art in the late 60s and the beginning of the 70s. This may raise the suspicion that I am referring to very much abstract visual formulas, but I want to underline that Van Gogh explores in his work at that period actually spaces of human interactions, which he called later interfacial spaces. So based on the natural perception capacities of the human eye, Van Gogh referred to the so-called positive illusory space, which was supposed to span between the viewer and the painting itself. The space is positive because it appears to the viewer, it opens a new space. But it's illusory, of course, as it happens on a very flat surface of the painting. So Van Gogh's compositions give the impression of being very open, very dynamic and pulsating in color, and this effect was achieved by dispersing the background and use smooth transition between the juxtaposed colors. So Fanger composed simple circular centered paintings, but when he dealt with dual forms and experimented with the perception of boundaries between them, exploring the problem of identity and difference, the role of the boundary between objects and their interconnections. So it seems to me that his work suits perfectly to analyze also the philosophical dimension of the solidarity experience. But let me distinguish between four core moments of this experience to conceptualize the metaphor of leaning out to the other. The first one is the impulse. We are first. I work on a language from the theory of subjectivity, so it can be pretty much abstract, but I do hope that with the help also of visualized ideas, it will be a little bit easier to accept it. We are first dealing with an impulse which comes from outside, from the world, from another person, and which usually takes the shape of a request, an appeal, a summons, or in particularly dramatic situations, a cry for help. And this impulse makes the subject feel directly moved or touched by someone else's need or someone else's critical situation. So it is therefore the external reality that speaks to me, and it does so with a power that becomes stronger than me. I'm not able to ignore someone's critical position because it possesses me in some way that it's difficult to grasp. But the experience of such an impulse is therefore so-called concreative. I collide with the limits of my own ability to dispose of the world. Rather, it is the other person or the situation that disposes of me. It's difficult not to refer here to the experience of the war in Ukraine, for example, which resulted in a huge migration wave at the end of February 2022. In Poland, nobody was prepared for such a scale, and however, it was cognitively fascinating how deeply the image of the war invaded collective and individual consciousness, and how deeply the drama of that moment was actually perceived. So that's what I mean by the, let's say, the impulse. People felt very much affected at the deep collective level by the event and the situation of the refugees. So in a way, at the very early stage of this experience, the impulse of the Ukrainians in need of help was in a way frightening or paralyzing, because it came from the outside world and, let's say, shocked by what is happening. The second moment of this phenomenological analysis, how it is experienced by the subject, is the vibration. So the necessary condition to perceive such an impulse is, of course, the openness of the subject to allow it access to him or herself. So this kind of openness has acquired many names in the philosophical tradition, but the most common is the term conscience, which describes a kind of a reflexive capacity to respond to harm, suffering, or injustice in the world. So through a perceived impulse, the subject enters into vibration, and subjective activity appears here slowly. It is the subject himself who is sensitive enough to perceive an external impulse at all and understand it as a call or internal duty. So Fanger's composition presented here can be read as a moment of the subject's centrifugal force, which being sufficiently sensitive to external impulses changes the subject's shape from centric to eccentric. So that's why this circle changes in a kind of metamorphosis, as you can see. Directed from the middle of the composition outwards. So using the language of philosophical existentialism, the subject begins to perceive with or fill with the other his, her situation. And the subject experiences it as many philosophers of the late 20th centuries were using the term being shaken as a proper term to describe the experience of solidarity. Jan Patočka, the Czechoslovakian philosopher, is one of them who describes solidarity in these terms. It's very characteristic in many dramatic cases that require help. People are not ready to help, or their willingness to get involved remains very limited. In other words, the impulse to call for help goes unheard, simply unseen. German sociologist Hartmut Rosa talks about the lack of resonance. He is the author of the theory of resonance, showing that the impulse does not really resonate with people because they are not open enough to receive it. We can think about a resonating chamber in a guitar, for example. We need a kind of internal space to in order to get the resonance, get the impulse really working. So it's very similar with the models of subjectivity in the modern philosophy that are understood as a kind of entities that are ready to perceive something, what is coming from outside. And the third moment, which is the moment of leaning out, as a result of vibration, the subject transgresses or transcends the boundaries of its own autonomy and leans out to the other. So with the metaphor of leaning out to the other, I want to emphasize the moment of experience between two subjects in which the movement of leaning out becomes very ecstatic movement, from Greek word ekstatikon, to go beyond oneself. Although we are still dealing with two separate subjects, the one who helps and the one who needs help, at the same time the experience reconfigures the self and the other person, positioning them anew. So the subject becomes active on behalf of the other and is ready to meet the needs of the other. And above all, the phenomenon of solidarity makes it clear that this experience is about qualitatively more than just the relationship between two subjects. We have to do with a just new quality of something which is very much common. So the third painting here visualizes this kind of dynamic through a dual composition in which we see two autonomous red and yellow units separated by a strip of a pink that demarcates them from each other, and builds the painting background. But you can observe, however, that their shapes are very similar, and that despite the difference in the order of the colors used to show both objects, we are dealing with the same range of colors. So both objects are therefore very much autonomous structure, but at the same time they become part of a coherent composition, a kind of a larger whole. And the boundaries remain blurred, so the colors used flowing seamlessly into one another. Małgorzata Kosowska, a social psychologist who made recently research concerning the societal organization of help in Poland during the war in Ukraine, noticed that, that's the part of her commentary, the acts of solidarity also change the cognition. They influence how we perceive the reality around us and other people. So after acts of solidarity, people become cognitively open. They are able to focus on many different aspects of reality. They do not perceive it one-dimensionally, black and white, but they are ready to see diversity and make use of it. So they go beyond their fears or phobias or obsessions and certainly stereotypes. They are able to put a lot of effort into getting to know their surrounding. And I do believe that what I try to describe as this kind of leaning out to the other or to the other side of the other human, other person, is exactly what she was describing after analyzing or talking with people who were organizing help. And the fourth crucial moment of this experience is a kind of this kind of more which reveals the experience of solidarity, and it's a very much sphere creative character. So there is a structural moment in experience in solidarity which can be understood as a tendency to create a new and better order, to eliminate injustice or harm, etc. So from the experience of solidarity comes the tendency to create a new spherical space in which radical distance is minimized and particular identities are embodied in a new context. So the subjects co-create a sphere of greater whole that embraces the self and the other and is filled with the feelings of compassion, of hope, of equality, freedom, or simply a courage. The last of Fanger's analyzed composition, autonomous structure, similar to the previous ones, but different from each other, separated by a blue line in the middle. But there is also an important difference here. You can see they already lose the shape of separate entities, which was visible in the previous painting. So in fact, together they form a kind of a whole that exceeds their individuality, but does not destroy their autonomy. So this composition is a kind of a new whole, penetrating spheres that binds the separate and the individual into an over-individual structure. And this is a very important point for distinguishing solidarity from charity, for example. This kind of sphere-creating moment. Eduardo Galeano, an Uruguayan writer and traveler, very famous one, put in a very eloquent way by stating that unlike solidarity, which is horizontal and takes place between equals, charity is top-down, humiliating those who receive it and never challenging the implicit power relations. In the best cases, there will be justice someday, but high in heaven. Here on earth, charity does not worry injustice, it just tries to hide it. So I think one of the crucial moments in the tradition of solidarity is to see that it's always sphere creating. I mean, it becomes a project for a better organization of social life and takes on a kind of political character. But these phenomenological characteristics of solidarity are part of a direct dialogical relation and the somewhat overly dramatic context. I want to propose that solidarity is ultimately embedded in individual experience. If, however, the phenomenon of solidarity was to concern only the dialogical relationship, the face-to-face encounter, it would encapsulate the range of highly differentiated social experiences that we used to call solidarity. So I'm convinced that the uniqueness of this phenomenon lies precisely in transcending the perspective of the first person singular, but also the dialogical perspective, toward a generalizing perspective, a commitment to a better organization of the common world. Thus, in order to broaden the field in which the metaphor of leaning out to the other is embedded, I will draw attention to three phases in the development of solidarity. The first one is the dramatic one. It is emotionally very much heated and irrational. It refers to the direct dialogical relationship described above, and it is the result of a very dramatic situation, the critical position of the other person, the experience of tension that is related to the suffering, harm, or injustice experienced by the other. In it, the leaning out to the other takes the form of a compassion or identifying with the harm of the other and activates a kind of sense of duty. From an ethical point of view, we are dealing here with a so-called deontological phenomenon, from Greek deon, duty. Duty towards the other person is more important than achieving our goal when we take the risk to help. So after all, our attempts may always fail. In other words, solidarity makes sense to the helping subject even if the goal cannot be achieved, because it is a kind of intrinsic value for the subject. I help because I feel motivated by this kind of impulse that came to me from another person. So the sphere of such an experience is affectively and emotionally very intense. And although the other is further other in this phase, it is able to become the closest, and the situation becomes a kind of intimate, dramatic situation, evoking a sense of closeness that breaks the distance radically, although it does not, after all, endure the otherness of the other. So the risk connected to solidaristic attitude is fundamentally impulsive, of irrational. It is also worth mentioning that this phenomenon is referred to as supererogation. So it denotes a type of action in which the acting person does more than it's required by duty or customary social norms of the law. So that's the first moment. The second, from the three moments, is the sphere widening. It's also emotionally heated one, but in this case it's much more rational. So the second phase is that of sphere widening. This phase is emotionally heated, rational. It's related to the sphere creative moment mentioned above, broadening the first person perspective and triggering rational generalization. So it involves the neutralization and objectification of the dialogical experience, whereby the concrete other becomes every other. So solidarity, therefore, takes into account social multiplicity and widens its horizon. So this phase of development reveals two important characteristics of leaning out to the other. The first one is agonistic one. It's the agonistic character of solidarity. It's, after all, opposition to injustice, which often turns into a struggle for the restoration of justice in general, not only in the specific case. And the second characteristic is concerns emancipation. So solidarity, as one of the key political ideas of the Enlightenment, is able to transform feelings of solidarity into a project for a more just world. So it appeals to the great ideas of freedom, of equality, dignity, humanity, justice, and is very much typical of the emergence of social movements, for example. So I do believe that this, in the second phase, it's just the social mobilizations typical. And the third one, the last one, is institutionalization. It's emotionally pretty cooled, but also very rational. This is one in this phase that solidarity is inscribed in the catalog of desirable behavior, but by the moral norms in force. So in other words, solidarity becomes routinized and leads to an emotional cooling of the phenomenon, which takes the form of legal and political mechanisms. We know it from social policy, tax policy, like, for example, solidarity tax, or migration policy. So in this phase, social equality deepens, but feelings of solidarity actually disappear. So cool down or marginalize. So in this phase, therefore, it contradicts the sense of intrinsic duty in the ontology, which henceforth becomes law. It is also contradicts the so-called supererogatory meaning of solidarity, turning into an obligation that is imposed, thus becoming very much vertical rather than horizontal. It is worth noting, however, that the process of institutionalization creates a better cultural conditions to sensitize society to the need to lean out to the other when new impulses of the call for solidarity emerge. In other words, this phase contributes to the intensification of solidarity phenomena as it inscribes solidarity behavior within the, let's say, natural competence of the society. So this is the part of everyday behavior. There is a beautiful performance action from 2007 of Polish artist Piotr Uklański, who invited people to wear white and red uniforms, and he just took the shot, and then he said, "Okay, thank you and goodbye." So they went out, and this moment was the second shot he made. I like it very much because it shows that after the goal had been achieved, it actually disappears, and it's independent of many factors, whether the society becomes a very much solidaristic one, or this phenomenon and the sensitivity for solidaristic behavior disappears. And just summarize, conclude. I want to emphasize once again how deeply heterogeneous a phenomenon solidarity actually is. And its genesis in enlightenment is precisely the emerging social differentiation inherent in modern democracy. So solidarity is part of the enlightenment promise of more free and more equal world. And its heterogeneous character lies in its leaning out to the other, its willingness to affirm difference and to seek a common horizon in which different life projects can be realized. So much for summary. And finally, I'd like to ask, why is this important today? Why return to the question of the meaning of solidarity? To answer these questions, I would like to draw your attention to three fundamental reductionisms that are becoming pretty much apparent in our late modernity. First, we see today in many spheres of social and political life an implosion of solidarity, which, triggered by a sense of a threat, collapses within the closed boundaries of very much populist promises of homogeneous world that can be made great again. It is important to show that the phenomenon of solidarity is an entirely different principle of action. The second, since the beginning of the 19th century, the idea of solidarity expressed the opposition to the culture of market capitalism, which has helped to turn the market economy into market society. So by betting on competitiveness, it deprived society of cultural skills of cooperation and mutual trust. The analysis research from the last decades show pretty clearly how deeply we are deprived of forms of social cooperation in our late modern societies. And the third and last one, related to the second reductionism in the third one, which refers to the escalation of individualism. I'm convinced that what we especially need to realize today is that we have more in common with the world than we have been told so far. So that we are faced today with the possibility of freeing ourselves from the dangers of technologies that polarize us politically and alienate us from our natural social environment. But and that the other towards which we must lean out is the natural environment, and that the culture of its exploitation urgently demands a culture of care and interconnection. And I think solidarity is exactly the path we might want to follow. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Jacek. That was brilliant. Now we'll open the floor to questions. Jacek, do you mind if I sit next to you?
Oh, yeah.
I'll trap you in. Maybe I'll ask the first one so that no one steals my question. So, it seems to me that solidarity always involves a conflict. So if we talk about solidarity on the left, it's basically solidarity among the working class against capitalists or imperialists internationally. If we talk solidarity on the right, it's mostly nationalism, which is basically preaching solidarity among your own kind, and meaning, you know, you have to hate someone across the border who speaks a different language. So my question is, can solidarity really exist at all? Or what are the prospects of solidarity in an increasingly better fed, more egalitarian and more democratic society, especially in its leftist sense? But at the same time, can we really talk about solidarity in this postmodern sense about which you talked in the end of your lecture, in a society that is still dealing with the first world problems, really, that is not well fed, that, you know, is still there?
Thank you very much for this question. I finished my lecture with a kind of optimistic view, but I'm not so very optimistic thinking about solidarity. It was always connected to the, let's say, modern forms of modern society. And when we take a closer look, especially in the last decades, we see very clearly that actually the institutions that created modern society are pretty weak. So we do not have social classes anymore, or they are very much, or they are disappearing. At least it's really hard to talk about very clearly divisions and identities of social classes, especially with the new weak middle class that transforms into I have forgotten now the word. I'll come back to it. So, I mean, the power of the political parties, when we are talking about actually 19th century forms of representative democracy, which, I mean, did not change since the 19th century, really. And we are talking about pretty weak workers' organizations, which shows there are many sociologists dealing with the thesis that the society is over, in the sense that we are no more able as to act as political actors on the political scene, because the traditional institutions which made modern society working are no more there, or are, I mean, weakened enough to not to be able to have an impact on the political reality. So there is a tendency to see that perhaps with this change, or dramatic change we can observe in the last decades, it's we are over with solidarity, so that there is no condition for new forms of solidaristic behaviors. So that's also, let's say, a dramatic or pessimistic scenario for the future. It can be that we are in the digital age, that we are no more able to create this kind of solidaristic bonds. there was always one condition which was of crucial importance, and it was a place where people gathered together and worked together. And we should see that with this huge mobilization we can observe in the recent decades, we have no more this kind of places that, especially in the industrial age, played such a crucial role for the solidaristic behavior or form of modern solidarity, like factories. People were working together for decades. They could hate each other, but they also trusted each other because that was the common destiny, that was the common future. And we do not have factories where not only things had been produced, but most of all solidarity bonds had been produced. So one of the famous sociologists, Zygmunt Bauman, said that with the end of the industrial era, we will have a huge problem with creating or producing solidarity bonds in the modern societies. So whatever we think about the links or the left or the right side of the political scene, I'm afraid we have the same problem or the same challenge we need to face in the future.
Thank you. No, lots of questions. Charles was first.
Jacek, thank you for
Charles, we have a mic, sorry.
Jacek, thank you for a tremendous presentation. My question follows on Donat's, though it's not quite the same. Through my political life, solidarity has been a big theme that recurs. But for me, the core question is solidarity with whom in all of these cases. So to take the two examples that you particularly, or two of the examples you mentioned, social class and employment, and gender, or the women's movement, or feminism. On social class, there were deep questions about who you were being solidarity with. Even the great Solidarność movement in Poland, there were many, many people who thought that they were class traitors. There were people in Britain, in the Britain Labour movement, who believed that Lech Wałęsa and Solidarność were class traitors. A terrible point of view. But obviously within Poland itself, which you know much better than I, there were deep tensions all around the question of Solidarność, solidarity with whom? Well, coming through to the current day, if you look at the debates within the women's movement and feminism about the whole trans idea, there are very sharp, very, very deep divisions about the way that this subject should be dealt with within the women's movement, let alone more widely. And I myself know many people who are very, very angry about this question. But again, the same question, solidarity with whom are we talking about in these kinds of debates? And Donatus touched on the other one I was going to mention, which is nationalism. Solidarity with whom? Is it solidarity with other Scots or whoever it may be? Or is it solidarity with the wider society? And I think finding ways to define the answer to the question, solidarity with whom, is an important mechanism to help illuminate some of the points you made in your excellent talk.
I think, Charles, what you are talking about is actually what we can observe in the last decades, and which was also called identity politics. We are very much interested and focused on who we are, and answering the question who we are always comes together with answering the question who we are not. So unfortunately, philosophy teaches us that talking about identity is always talking about difference and just shaping boundaries which give us the chance to distinguish between us and the others. So the us and them logic is hidden beside the identity politics we can observe in the recent decades. There is also many political scientists taking into consideration that this kind of tendency in our Western world culture leads to a huge conflictual zone, and it's in a way I'm afraid we don't know where's the how to lose the problem. So I'm afraid we will live in a very conflictual moment in the political culture, where the so-called identity politics played just a crucial role and make the temperature of the conflict even higher. I mentioned solidarity as a possible solution because I do believe that there is also another tendency not to take the identity as such an important element of the making politics, but rather to take a closer look at the, let's say, common problems, but also a greater good, or that good that demands from us a lot of different sensitivity we do not have today. So I think we need to work intensively with so-called politics of care, and in which we try to exercise in a slightly different behavior than the one connected to identity politics. I'm afraid it's a deep cultural problem, of course, and I'm afraid through the very much market society-based culture, we are very much skilled in competition rather than in cooperation. And if we take into consideration this kind of conflictual zones we have to face today, it's really worth to think about just different educational programs for schools. And it won't be easy to lose the problem you have mentioned. I think it's one of the biggest educational challenges for the coming decades, I'm afraid.
Thank you for that talk. I'm an ancient historian by trade, and so the concepts of like solidarity and nationalism really are not in operation in my late Bronze Age world, right? But I was struck by how you went through the development of solidarity and how much of it has in common with what Gellner outlined for the development of nationalism. And Gellner saw nationalism as inherently exclusionary, and Hobsbawm went so far to say there's no way you can ever avoid nationalism becoming ethnic nationalism, which seems quite the opposite of the way you described solidarity until you got to that phase 3 of institutionalization, right? And so my question for you is the broad, simple question: what's the relationship between solidarity and nationalism? And a more specific one: do you see solidarity as inevitably becoming nationalism when it hits phase 3, that institutionalization?
At the very beginning, I mentioned Richard Sennett, an amazing book about togetherness. Actually, analyzes showing the weakness of our culture in the late capitalism we were talking about. And so for him, the solidarity is very much has a very much negative connotation, which means we need to understand who we are and answer the question on our identity, and at the same time make us very clear who we are and who does not belong to us. But of course, this kind of tradition of thinking about solidarity is here. So it will be a swan song to say, now I fight against it, and I'm pretty certain I will succeed. That's for sure not the case. But I would like to draw attention to just different tradition which appeared at the very core, in the beginning of the solidarity, as the solidarity was born in the 19th century in Europe, and just to take a closer look at the solidarity as a kind of let's say, an immune system, in which who we are is always defined by broadening horizon and being confronted with the otherness, with the danger, and through that transforming our immunology into the stronger one, because immunology is always about connecting the sameness with the otherness, and confrontation with the otherness, with the dangers that are always outside, is part of this game. So in a way, solidarity can be understood as a art of life, where we try to create a culture where the ability to confront ourselves with the otherness and to make this step of a risk, is actually a central part, or the DNA of our behavior and who we are. But then we do not talk so much about identity, but rather are concentrated on the difference. So taking into consideration how to make the step forward and to change the, let's say, the construction of our identity. So when I was talking about the leaning out to the other, I thought about this kind of gesture, which appears very, very often actually in the history of humankind, especially in the modernity. I made a reference to Poland, to the wave of refugees from February 2022. One cannot forget, in Poland we have a pretty much right-wing oriented populist government, extremely nationalizing or misusing the history for political reasons. And to be honest, the history of neighborhood between Poland and Ukraine, it's definitely not the perfect one. So misusing for political reasons, a Ukrainian threat, or misusing it for some political conflicts in the last years, what's actually what was pretty obvious thing for the Polish government. But then, we had to do. We were confronted with the total war in Ukraine, and they had to change the political narrative from the nationalistic one, very much focused on the identity politics and not so much on the leaning out to the other. They had to redefine the way they deal with history, especially with other nations. And we are talking about extremely homogeneous country, which goes through a tremendous metamorphosis. Right now, we are the most migrant-oriented country in Europe in this year, with over 3 million Ukrainian people living in Poland. So we are go through a tremendous transformation. Also, in order to thinking about people's capability to deal with the otherness that appears on the street, with the other languages, with other behavior, and so on and so on. And so it's a moment of a very deep transformation, fascinating moment to observe what is going on and how people try to deal with the, let's say, identity differences and find a solution and broaden the horizons and work on their immune system in order to integrate the otherness into that what they until now called the Polishness, which was so clearly distinguished from the perspective of ethnicity in the country. So a very hard moment, I think, but also interesting to observe what is happening with the nationalization you were talking about and the perspective of the leaning out of the solidarity perspective that that appears and starts to be a real challenge in this very, very much modern society. I don't know if I answered your questions, but
I don't know if there really is.
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We have to see how the situation plays out.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Brent.
Thank you very much, Jacek. That was extremely interesting, very, very nuanced and stimulating. My question is really to do with an aspect that didn't feature so much, which is religion. I mean, if you go back to the early modern period, that would, and possibly even earlier, but I mean, early modern period will do. A big object of solidarity, focus for solidarity, was religious, fellow feeling. So, for instance, Protestants or Puritans, particularly in this country, would feel a strong sense of solidarity with Protestants in the Low Countries and in Germany, and if they suffered, then then English Protestants suffered, and so this was a strong sense of togetherness. And going then into the 20th century, I mean, with solidarity, I wonder how important it was. I mean, in Gdansk and elsewhere, that the people you mentioned, they didn't only work in the same factories, but in many cases they also went to mass together on a Sunday. And I just wonder if could you the overall absence, I may have missed a beat somewhere, but the overall absence of religion was a bit striking. I wonder whether that was conscious or whether you would build it into your model at all.
Taking a closer look at the phenomenon of Polish solidarity movement, where the religious tradition played a very important role. One cannot forget when Polish solidarity appeared, was born in August 1980. The entire left scene in New York was just scared that we have to do with a dogmatic Catholic revolution in Central and Eastern Europe, and they could not accept it, with the Pope at the bottom of the entire political theater we had to do at that time. So, yeah, in a way, it was, of course, an important element for the identity of the movement. But what one cannot forget was also a very hard moment to integrate very different groups of the society at that time. It's easy to think about solidaristic dimension of the phenomenon from the perspective of the success. But like with workers' movement in the 19th century, which we seen as very coherent institutions, it was extremely hard to get into the moment of being together and then broadening horizons and reaching other groups of people. In Polish case, it was the problem between intellectuals and the workers who did not want to cooperate. It was a very conflictual zone between these two social classes. But it was also a huge challenge for the workers, because some of them got better jobs and very well paid, and the others were in a very poor condition. So it was extremely hard to reach each other and to formulate the same demands, which happened actually through a very fascinating process of 2-3 weeks in Gdansk, and resulted with the so-called August Agreement that allowed to create the independent trade unionism, first trade unionism in the Central and Eastern Europe. But you're right, the religion played an extremely important role in it, but it was at the same time fascinating, full of contradictions. It was the Catholic Church supporting very much liberal elites and inviting them into the churches and spaces that belonged to the church as a spaces of free thinking and very much liberal oriented debates. So it's an interesting moment full of contradictions where the church was able to transcend their own horizon of how they deal with political reality and create a kind of political and social laboratory for exchanging thoughts and working out on the future perspective. And I'm not sure whether it's always the case. So we have very much, we had to do with a movement that was very much liberal in a way it thought about the political future, but at the same time very much socialist and supported by Catholic Church. So I'm afraid it's a phenomenon full of contradictions, actually, and the church playing very significant role in it. Wasn't on a very classical position churches normally play in a society. So the authoritarian regime changed completely their roles, also the role that the church had played. So I think it's a rather avant-garde kind of example when we take into consideration the solidarity movement in Poland at the beginning of the 80s. Yeah.
Cesare. Yes, you have the access to wealth of questions.
We have two questions online. I don't know if we'll be able to go through them both, but the first one is, can you compare your understanding of solidarity with Patočka's, I think, and Tischner's understandings? Where does it differ?
Okay. 70s and the beginning of the 80s in the 20th century is a very interesting moment because when we take into consideration the history of solidarity idea, it appears at the beginning of the 19th century in France, that it moves to Germany, especially socialists, communists, and social democracy. But then, after the Second World War, the term actually disappears from the intellectual debates. It is a part of the working class debates, but it's definitely not the term or the notion for intellectual debates. Albert Camus was a very skeptical and wrote in the one of his essays that it's when we think about solidarity, we need to think about the solidarity in the solitude with others who are also very much alienated from the world of humanistic values. And the reason for that was, I think, the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the catastrophe for humanity. So people were very scared to use this big ideals as point of reference in the political debates. And it is the late 70s and the beginning of the 80s, especially the solidarity movement in Poland, when the term, the idea, comes back. In my opinion, actually, the late 70s in Central and Eastern Europe is actually a great comeback of solidarity idea. And it came back because of several people. Jan Patočka, a Czechoslovakian philosopher, was certainly one of them. But just only in one essay, Wars in 20th Century and the 20th Century as War, a beautiful essay, he wrote about solidarity, but also solidarity of those who needs to talk about the future of the reality and liberate themselves, at least in their private lives, in the intimate sphere, from this authoritarian surrounding, let's say. So that was the first impulse in the intellectual history of Europe that the term solidarity appeared in the public discourse. And then shortly after the death of Jan Patočka, Václav Havel wrote a beautiful essay about the power of the powerless, dedicated to Jan Patočka. And he was very much inspired by this essay already mentioned by Patočka about the wars in the 20th century. So he made a use of the idea of solidarity and transformed it into a kind of political vision of those who want to live in truth and create a kind of alternative society of anti-politics, because they cannot be part of the official political life. They do not belong to the Communist Party, they are the opposition. So the only thing they can do is just to use the opportunity and to meet in the private sphere, which can be the new political future for their countries. So that's the movement which takes place at the end of the 70s. And so in my opinion, Patočka is the author of very much existentially interpreted solidarity. Then it transforms into a political solidarity in essays of Václav Havel at the end of the 70s. And then there is this huge explosion of Polish solidarity movement, which was so practical, so much involved in losing in the practical things they had to do in this kind of political revolution. They did not have time to think about solidarity. But there was one thinker, one philosopher in Poland, Józef Tischner, who wrote a beautiful essay about the ethics of solidarity, and he made a use of the metaphors from Jan Patočka essay. I don't know if he read, but I think he read the essay of Patočka and he was very much inspired by it. But we have I have no documentation of it. But certainly there is a lot of similarities between the notion of solidarity created by Patočka and the notion of solidarity created by Tischner. But Tischner is deepening actually the social dimension of solidarity and is describing or interpreting the appearance of a social movement that wants to liberate the whole society from the authoritarian regime. So the difference is actually the one, whether Patočka is very much focused on the very weak oppositional groups of people in the Czechoslovakian society. Tischner describes the societal and political explosion in Poland, of course, and deals with the dignity of work and with the entire ethos of working class in his essay. So I do believe there is a huge difference between Patočka and Tischner. Tischner is very much focused on the also socialistic vision of solidarity, where Patočka is very much focused on the existential dimension of living in solidarity with others. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jacek. This was really brilliant. I think we've learned a lot. Thank you, the audience, for your very well thought out questions. As Cesare said, there is wine afterwards, so don't run away. Thank you very much.
Thank you.